Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this virtual discussion hosted by the Nature Conservancy, Alaska, featuring Alaskan fishermen and industry experts on our changing oceans and marine environments. This is, an issue that's top of mind for everybody right now. And so I'm really excited to hear from this expert group of panelists, and I'm happy you were able to join us today. My name is Ephraim Freilich, your moderator. Thankfully, I'm not one of the experts. I'm the founder and principal of Aqua DC, a maritime policy consulting firm based in Juneau. I'm a born and raised Juneau kid. I've worked on fisheries and climate policy for the entirety of my, relatively brief career, and I'm really excited just to hear from these folks as we move forward today with the TNC's Alaska Climate Opportunities Assessment Series. TNC is engaged in a new effort this summer and fall that's been ongoing to look at the Alaska climate, to look at the merits of bipartisan climate solutions, TNC has partnered with McKinley Research Group to commission research on Alaska's unique opportunities to address climate change and assess the economic implications of recent, current, and future investment or policies. During today's discussion, we will explore the efforts and perspectives of fisheries leaders and industry experts from across the state. As we all know, Alaska is ground zero for climate impacts. We are seeing stuff happen at faster rates and more significantly than really anywhere else in the world. Warming 2 to 3 times the global average, the effects from climate change are just beginning to be realized. Hosting a dialogue like this is part of the Nature Conservancy in Alaska's mission as we work to create space to discuss policy and real-world impacts. We have, like I mentioned, a really wonderful panel here of folks to hear from. Following the introductory remarks that I'm making now and that each panelist will make, we'll engage in a Q&A. There is a Q&A chat box there for you to enter your questions in. And like I said, I will moderate and kind of kick into the proper panelists. And at any point, feel free to drop questions into the chat in the bottom right-hand side of your screen. And so I'll quickly run through each of our panelists, and then I'll do a more in-depth introduction when we get to their turn to speak. So we have Linda Benken, a commercial fisherman and executive director of the Alaskan Longline Fishermen's Association. Linda's longer bio, because she's involved in literally everything that I ever see on this stuff, will come in a second. And then we also have Julianne Curry, so commercial fisherman and public affairs manager at OBI Seafoods and Icicle. And we have Weatherly Bates from Alaska Shellfish Farms, and Peter Westley, associate professor of the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences at UAF. Matt Allward was hoping to be here today. He's a commercial fisherman and president of the United Fishermen of Alaska, but he is out fishing today, which is a fair excuse to miss the Fishermen on Climate panel. So without any further delay, we'll hop in, and I'm going to introduce Linda here. Linda Benken has a BA from my alma mater, Dartmouth College, and a master's in environmental science from Yale University. Linda refuses to get education anywhere outside of the Ivies, she has told me. She has fished commercially off Alaska since 1982, both as a deckhand and an owner-operator. She's been at the helm of the Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association since 1991. Alpha does innovative work and really leads the way when it comes to sustainable fisheries and thriving fishing communities through policy engagement. When I was working back in DC for Senator Murkowski, I promise I never ever heard from Linda on pressing fisheries or climate issues. She served on the council, the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, I should say, from 92 to 2001. And she was an industry advisor to the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission and the National Academies of Science Individual Fishing Quota Review Panel. That was a lot of words. In the interest of time, I'm gonna skip some more of Linda's bio because it keeps going on. But really excitingly, in 2016, and I was there for this, Linda was recognized as a White House champion of change for sustainable seafood by President Obama. And in 2019, Alpha also received the Lowell Thompson Award for the Alaska Conservation Foundation. And it's really exciting to be able to introduce you, Linda, and hear about really the eyes and ears of climate change on the water are, you as a fisherman, but also to hear about the innovative work that you continue to do. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much for that introduction. I guess I've always said that my real education started when I went fishing at 19, but there's all the other stuff too, you know. Yeah, so diving in, we certainly are on the front lines as fishermen. Climate change is affecting every aspect of our lives and our work, and doing so at an accelerating pace. What was once a rumble in the background is now a roar, and climate impacts are not something that our children might face in the future, but something that could really change or preclude our children from having the same opportunities and future that we've had working on the water. We're seeing the impacts of climate change in Alaska's fisheries every day, from large shifts in fish abundance and distribution to seabird die-offs and whale strandings. We are in the front lines, and the pace of change is really dizzying right now. By way of some examples, the warm blob years off in the Gulf of Alaska, which are predicted to reoccur with increasing frequency, drove an 80% drop in Gulf of Alaska Pacific cod. Melting sea ice is likely the driving force, and the 98% drop we've just seen in Bering Sea opelio crab stocks over the past 2 years. And closer to home here in Southeast, the scarcity of seabirds relative to 5 years ago when we're fishing is eerie, as is the sudden concentrations this summer that we saw of feed or forage fish in pockets of colder water near shore and offshore seabirds coming near shore to feed, indicating they weren't finding the feed they usually find offshore. We're worried, and our organization, Alpha, is prioritizing climate action. As the foundation for the action, we need to change the economics that are currently driving greenhouse gases. Adding carbon to the atmosphere has a high cost to the future, but the industries responsible are not fitting the bill. Alpha supports a carbon fee and dividend program to capture the cost of carbon and drive global economics towards meaningful climate action while offsetting impacts to lower income families. We're also deeply involved in shaping nature-based climate solutions, such as the 30 by 30 initiative, which seeks to conserve 30% of our nation's lands and waters by 2030. That is key to our support, that the language addresses conserve in this initiative and includes in conservation, sustainable businesses and regenerative relationships to lands and waters, and recognizes the need to support local economies while restoring or maintaining ecosystem health. Critical to the initiative is Indigenous stewardship and recognition that people have lived, worked, harvested, and managed these lands and waters for thousands of years while maintaining the health and productivity of these ecosystems. We have a lot to learn. We're working with tribes and other community-based sustainable businesses across the nation to address climate change through a new coalition called Businesses for Conservation and Climate Action. BCCA has identified Southeast Alaska, Bristol Bay, the Pribilof Islands, and the Northern Bering Sea climate resilience areas as emergent opportunities to create the 30 by 30 model for the nation. At the nexus of these two efforts, changing the economics of climate change and promoting nature-based climate solutions, Alpha works with our partner organization, our Fisheries Trust, to research and publish an annual report for the Southeast Alaska ecosystem called Seabank. Seabank captures the economic value of Southeast Alaska's natural capital, ecosystem services, and annual dividends paid year after year, provided we do not undermine the health of that natural capital, which is, of course, the forests, the waters, the estuaries, and the oceans. The dividends, of course, include salmon and other fish and wildlife, along with fisheries, recreation, and tourism. Ecosystem services include carbon sequestration, water flow, and landside moderation, to name a few. We know this incredible Seabank is worth more than dollars and cents, but we have found that some decision makers can't see the forest for the timber without it. Closer to home, we've worked with our fleet to increase fuel efficiency and identify next steps to zero emission commercial fishing boats. We received an ETIP award that allows us to work with the National Research Energy Lab to design hybrid diesel electric systems, and are looking for funding to support implementation or conversion of 2 to 3 commercial fishing boats to hybrid systems with careful documentation of costs and savings to pave the way for fleet conversion. Here in Sitka, our electricity is hydro generated, as it is in many other communities in Southeast Alaska, where the water flow is strong and often. So we see an opportunity to significantly reduce our carbon footprint by moving the boats towards an electric hybrid and eventually, hopefully, a zero emission fishing fleet. But fishermen are a show me crowd who need technology they can trust. So we plan to create the hybrids and test them, document all that, hopefully eventually the zero emission boats, to secure that trust by showing that it can and will be done. In the fisheries world, we advocate for habitat protection, low impact and selective fishing gear, and management strategies that provide for the sustained participation of community-based fishermen. Our small-scale fishermen are fierce advocates for ocean health. They care about handing off healthy oceans to the next generation, but they need access to fisheries to continue that stewardship. We recognize that management of fisheries need to be increasingly risk adverse and with an emphasis on long-term resilience rather than optimizing harvest. Increased monitoring of ocean change is essential, as is enhanced management responsiveness. Climate change is happening fast, but we are well past the point where research is all we can do. Our motto has become, the time is now to address climate change. We recognize we all need to do more and to do it faster. I really look forward to hearing from other panelists and to the question and answer conversation to learn from all of you. Thank you, and I'll hand it back to Ephraim.
Thank you so much, Linda. I really appreciate that. And, you know, like I mentioned briefly earlier, you know, fishing communities and fishermen really are oftentimes the eyes and ears of climate change and any change going on in our environment. And so I'm really excited for that reason to introduce our next speaker, Julianne Curry, who I mentioned is a commercial fisherman and public affairs manager for OBI and Icicle. Julianne is one of the few people who can probably say she is a true lifelong fisherman. I think Julianne's been fishing since, you know, pretty much soon after she could walk on her family's boat. And in addition to a lifelong career in commercial fishing, she's also had 15 years of experience in the policy world for fisheries in Alaska. Prior to her current role, she was the executive director and lobbyist of the United Fishermen for Alaska. And this is nothing negative about Mr. Allward, who couldn't join us today, but that's a difficult job to have. And Julianne, I have firsthand knowledge of how well she was able to navigate that world. And she was also the executive director of the Petersburg Vessel Owners Association, a regional commercial fisheries group comprised of over 100 members. She has been participating in Alaska's regulatory processes, including the state's Board of Fisheries and the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, where she has served as a member of the advisory panel to the council. She currently serves on the communications committee and the salmon committee with the Alaska Seafood Marketing Institute. And so Julianne, thank you so much for being here with us today, and we're excited to hear you.
Thanks for that introduction, Ephraim. It's always challenging to follow Linda with her breadth of knowledge and experience. And I've really learned a lot from Linda in my years of being an advocate in the seafood policy arena. We've worked hand in hand at the Port of Fish. We've worked hand in hand at the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. So it's really an honor to be part of this panel today and to be able to speak alongside of many of these very expert panelists. So my area of expertise is not necessarily when it comes to climate change like some of the other panelists, but I do have extensive experience in the commercial fisheries world and now also in the seafood processing world, which has opened my eyes to a whole nother host of issues when it comes to figuring out what's going on with Alaska's climate and how to respond to that as a seafood processing company. So for the OBI Seafoods, that I represent as the public affairs manager, we have 10 processing platforms across the entire state of Alaska. We operate in nearly every single regulatory area throughout the state, sometimes with multiple platforms. And we shift that effort around the state depending on what's happening with the fish stocks, which oftentimes can be influenced by what's happening with the climate in the state of Alaska. So for the icicle side of things, we mainly harvest in the Bering Sea and Aleutian Islands with the groundfish fisheries. Our OBI processing facilities, we process all of the things that our harvesters bring us. So major species like salmon and crab and cod and pollock and herring as well. So a lot of small boat fishermen, a lot of family operations. We're really, really proud of the harvesters that we have under our umbrella as a processing company. So the interesting thing about working for the processing sector is that we have to, just like managers do, kind of gauge and guess what's going to be happening with fish stocks around the state of Alaska to be able to right size the operations that we have and respond to shifting fish stocks. It's a very challenging exercise. You have to make sure that you have the right number of employees at each facility to be able to respond to what's going to be returning, whether it's salmon or whether it's some of the other species that we process. It's a little bit of a game of darts and a little bit of crystal ball, and a lot of listening to what our managers in the state of Alaska and from the federal side present to us when it comes to what we can expect with our fish returns and what we're able to process from what our harvesters bring to us. So our operations are shore-based, obviously, and like many Alaskans that catch and hunt their own food, we can't just pick up our operations and move them around to be responsive to what's happening with fish stocks in the state of Alaska. So we work really hard to make sure that we're sending the right amount of people to the facilities that we have that we operate to be able to respond to these shifts. We've seen a number of changes over the past decade, and of course, fish stocks always change and they always shift, and what goes up must come down. But in Southeast Alaska in particular, we've seen some pretty dismal returns for our salmon stocks, particularly pinks and Keta, since about 2014. We had an uptick this year, which was a really, really good boon to our fishermen and to the communities that we operate in there and to the region as a whole. But in that period of time where our harvesters were really struggling to be able to make a living and fish stocks were just not returning as much when it came to salmon, we were able to shift some of our focus to the Bristol Bay area, which in that time period has seen record returns of sockeye. So we work as hard as we can to be responsive to what's happening with climate change and the shift in the species that we process. And we've definitely seen a lot of changes over the years that we really try and keep track of and do the best that we can to be responsive. So one of the things that we do is we make sure that we work hard and advocate at the state legislature level and of course with Congress to make sure that there's adequate funding for the research that needs to be done. So we can get a clearer picture of what's happening in the state of Alaska, what's impacting our fish stocks, and try and get a better idea of what's to come. We're incredibly lucky in this state. We have the best fisheries management in the world. And I know, at times it can seem like that's not necessarily the case, but really we are so incredibly lucky in this state with the high quality managers we have and the people who really go above and beyond to make sure that there is seafood around for generations, not only for the commercial harvesting industry, but also for our friends over in the sport fishing sector and the personal use sector, and of course our subsistence harvesters in the state of Alaska. But just to give a little bit of background about what the seafood industry brings to the table in the state of Alaska, speaking of great fisheries management, we produce more wild seafood than all of the other US states combined. Our industry produces enough seafood each year to feed every single person in the world at least one serving of Alaska seafood, which is 12.9 billion servings annually. Our state of Alaska commitment to sustainable management has allowed the state's fisheries to produce large, diversified harvests for many decades. Approximately 5.7 billion pounds of seafood worth $2 billion was harvested annually in the 2017 and 2018 year range. We produce 2/3 of the nation's seafood harvest in a typical year, which is home to 9 of the top 20 US fishing ports by value. We're known worldwide as the model for sustainable management. The efforts of the region's biologists, our managers, and our policymakers ensures healthy stocks and productive fisheries for Alaska harvesters and the businesses and communities that rely on their catches. Changing ocean and climate conditions present an emerging challenge to this industry, obviously, but the managers are tracking it really closely. So those are some of the statistics. Big business. The vast majority of our harvesters and the vast majority of the people who fish in the state of Alaska are small family fishermen. These are people who are out on the water every single day, working as hard as they can to bring sustainable seafood to not only global markets, but also to Alaskans. So that's my intro done. Ephraim, I'll hand it back to you, and thank you for the time.
Yeah, absolutely, Julianne. Really, really appreciate those comments, and thank you so much. And Next, we have Weatherly Bates from Alaska Shellfish Farms. And I think it's really awesome to have kind of Weatherly here as well for this, for diversity. We've heard from Linda, a Southeast Alaska commercial fisherman, and now we've heard from Julianne, commercial fisherman, and from the processing sector. And we have Weatherly from the aquaculture and aquatic farming industry. And I think it's helping to round out our panel here. Weatherly is an Alaskan aquatic farmer, mother, environmentalist, and ecologist. Her area of expertise is growing and marketing high-value aquatic plants and shellfish for direct consumer and wholesale markets. Her approach models a healthy marine environment where aquatic species are grown naturally without feed or fertilizer. Only the aquatic farm structure, creating ecosystem-based services, including carbon sequestration, increased biological diversity, and economic revenue. Weatherly's farm, Alaska Shellfish Farms, is located in Halibut Cove, Kachemak Bay, one of the most beautiful places I have ever been, and was established in 2010 by her and her husband, Greg Bates. Prior to Alaska, Weatherly managed an oyster farm in Maine after attending College of the Atlantic and graduating from the University of Rhode Island with a degree in aquaculture and fisheries technology. In a one-year growing season, Alaska Shellfish Farm produces about 800,000 oysters with only 2 to 3 people, which, you know, somebody who's never done aquatic farming like myself, that number is really mind-boggling and impressive. Weatherly and her family were named Alaska's Farm Family of the Year in 2020, which is really cool. And Weatherly grew up on the East Coast and was deeply impacted by significant decreases in marine finfish and shellfish. Something obviously that the East Coast has had to fare a lot sooner than folks in the Pacific Northwest. Weatherly's goal is to sustainably produce shellfish and sea vegetables through a sustainable farming model that benefits the environment. She views climate change as an existential threat and feels we need to model human practices more ecologically to continue to thrive on this planet. And instead of telling you more about what Weatherly feels, I will let Weatherly do it herself. And we're really excited to have you here. Thank you.
Thanks. And I did come from a fishing background. My dad was a fisherman and I grew up fishing my whole life, and then turned to aquaculture just, you know, as a way to do what we could. So I'm gonna just do a little background on what we do. We do suspended culture of Pacific oysters, blue mussels, and seaweeds in a glacier influenced area in Halibut Cove. Halibut Cove has a really rich history of harvesting from the ocean. The native Alaskans that inhabited the area for thousands of years, their mid-ends are full of clam shells. In the early 1920s, there was large-scale herring industry where 27 herring salteries operated around the cove with thousands of people until it collapsed in 1928 due to a lack of return. In the 1980s, Alaska's first aquatic farm was started in Halibut Cove, culturing blue mussels. And today there are several aquatic farms that coexist with a number of salmon set net sites that operate during the summer. We operate 52 weeks out of the year, harvesting year round. So I'm going to talk about a little bit of the challenges we faced with climate change. Our first experience was in 2008. The seed oysters we planted, we had like a really high mortality, up to 90%. And along the whole Pacific coast, there was a substantial oyster larval die-off. It was discovered that unusually acidic waters corroded the shells of oyster larvae, causing the larvae and juveniles to die. Fluctuating CO2 and acidity levels in ocean water are now buffered in hatcheries by adding sodium carbonate. The carbonate helps organisms like clams, mussels, oysters develop shells, which they can't do when the water is too acidic. So at the initial our first oyster die-off, we decided that we would diversify into growing mussels. The oysters we plant from our hatchery, but the mussels we can collect naturally just from the wild mussel set in our area. So we started growing blue mussels and they were doing amazing. And then another major setback happened like from 2014 to 2016, which Linda also touched on. There was a large mass of relatively warm water called the blob, which caused major losses at our farm site. Initially, we were closed to harvesting for prolonged periods due to toxic algae blooms caused by the marine dinoflagellate Alexandrium. And Alexandrium thrives when the other algae aren't growing because the blob is like nutrient poor conditions. And then by the end of 2015 and 16, we experienced complete die-offs of our entire mussel crop. It was like hundreds of thousands of pounds due to this, like the blob happening, what we think. Also, thousands of seabirds, hundreds of sea otters were also dead floating in our waters. So the blob is also thought to have decimated the Gulf of Alaska cod stocks and changed the marine makeup of the Gulf. The last couple of years for us have been relatively stable as far as improved oceanic conditions for shellfish culture. This year, the Gulf has seen normal temperatures, at times tending colder. And we have had a very productive year with concentrations of good algae. But as Linda said, these blob events are probably going to be happening more frequently in the future. So for us, the big question is, how will we continue to operate in the face of a warming climate and acidification? Well, reduced carbon emissions is for sure like something, but we are dealing what we have to right now. And we can't control the acidity levels through like adding sodium carbonate in the water as they do in a hatchery, which allows shell building of marine invertebrates. So on our farm, we think we can foster an environment where shellfish can thrive through integration of seaweeds. On our farm, dozens of seaweeds naturally set on every surface of our farm structure and grow from fall through the summer. These seaweeds are marketable for a variety of purposes like food, fertilizer, cosmetics, biofuels, to name a few. But they also play a main role in protecting our crops against detrimental effects of ocean acidification. Like Katmai Bay is thought to have some of the largest daily fluctuations in acidity due to the vast tidal range and glacial influxes. Our cold water is more sensitive to acidification. So from the carbon dioxide we're emitting into the atmosphere, the oceans uptaking at least 27% of the carbon dioxide, we're putting into the atmosphere. And the ocean is like absorbing that and protecting us for global warming. But this is also leading to like reduced pH and an increase in ocean acidification. Katmai Bay in the Arctic and Alaska are super sensitive to ocean acidification due to low seawater temperatures and a high influx of fresh water. This results in low pH and low levels of carbonate ions that animals need for shell building. But the good news is marine vegetation such as seaweeds and seagrasses exert strong mitigation effects on local seawater acidification. The kelps growing on our farm probably help buffer the OA by taking up the excess CO2. Studies show that the greater the rate of sea vegetation, the higher the rate of biological diversity and calcification for shell building organisms. So it's just, there is hope like for what we're doing. And also like as shellfish farmers, we're providing habitat for sea life to grow. Oyster reefs and kelp beds are extremely beneficial to the environment. So like the farm sequestering carbon, it's great. Like it can partner with, local fisheries. We can help increase diversity. I shared a couple pictures of like, we have, thousands of species of fish and invertebrates that live in our oyster cages. So I feel like what we're doing is giving back to the marine environment, and you don't need like to feed them. Like we're taking just the algae that's occurring in the water, or the shellfish are taking that and just like eating it. And we don't have to, we're just kind of like fostering this marine environment that like creates more diversity. So I think it could be like a huge part of Alaska's future, having shellfish farming. That's about it.
Well, Thank you so much, Weatherly. I really appreciate that and your perspective here. And just so everybody knows, Dr. Peter Wesley is going to join us in about 15 minutes when he finishes teaching class, as professors do. So until then, we will start our Q&A now and allow for a little bit of a discussion. And then when Dr. Wesley joins us, we will kick it to him for his introductory remarks, and then re-enter the Q&A session once more. And so I'll kick off the Q&A with just some kind of questions to get us started that can be answered by all of us. And then we can dive into, there's a few things in the chat box already. And I would just remind folks that, down at the bottom right hand of your bottom right hand part of your screen, there is a Q&A box you can open and enter your questions there, and our team will be monitoring that. And if we don't get to your question, I apologize, but we can follow up as well afterwards. Our panelists can, and I'll make sure everybody has the questions. So yeah, just for everybody, I come from a policy background, obviously, and that's the stuff, that's the area I work in. So I'm always thinking about what impacts policy can have on the issues we are seeing. And so when we look at, climate change, such a big issue, and Linda, you talked about some of the stuff like where BCCA, Businesses for Conservation and Climate Action, but when we're even more locally too, when we're talking about such a big thing like climate change and the impacts on fisheries and fish stocks, can you point to specific work, whether it's in Juneau, like you mentioned, Julianne, at the municipal level in your communities, or at the federal level, things that we should be looking for as policy movers, and things where we as stakeholders and constituents can have impacts, going and asking our representatives for action on some of these issues?
I'm happy to jump in on that first, if you'd like. I mean, I guess I would certainly reiterate the need to support carbon fee and dividend, a model for 30 by 30 that restores the health of local economies as well as sustainable environments, so sort of triple bottom line solutions to climate change. And I think Alaskans can support that locally and help sort of percolate that up to national action. I would say also in the fishery space, it's incredibly important to support habitat for fish across their full life cycle. So you can't have healthy salmon just by taking care of the ocean. Certainly you have to also take care of the salmon streams and making sure that we have in place the right protections for that habitat and resilience, or a precautionariness built in as we see climate change start to warm up rivers, put more pressure on fish stocks, and to move those fish to new places to help protect them in the new places where they might start showing up to spawn. I maybe could just tackle one or two of the questions that have come in so far about management and our outdated information. Are we keeping up with the pace of climate change? And, I'm not sure we always are. I know our scientists are trying to. I would just say in response to that question about spawning success that managers in both the halibut and sablefish fishery have recently become aware of a possibility of skip spawning in these stocks, which means they're not spawning every year, they're potentially spawning every other year. And they're factoring that into their models and to their calculations for setting catch limits and how much pressure we put in stocks. So yes, trying to keep up. It's absolutely essential that we do. And I think that fishermen are supportive of those changes to make sure we're not pushing stocks too hard. I think that there was another question about, are we giving fish a break where they need a break? And I can say that the council at this meeting will be looking at providing additional protections to crab stocks to offset this big decline that we've suddenly seen, and to understand what we need to do to protect habitat and to reduce the pressure on those stocks to allow those stocks to rebuild. So management and science are challenged right now. And we are working with the policymakers to keep up and make sure that enough is done to keep the fisheries healthy.
Thank you, Linda. Really appreciate that. And I think there was also a question about, have you selected who will be flipping the boats and if the work will be done locally within Alaska? And I think that was in reference to some of the stuff you were talking about on the electrification and hybridization.
Yes, sorry, I missed that one. Yes, so we are working with a young engineer who grew up in Haines and went outside to go to school, but he's back here in Alaska, and our plan is to do the work here in Sitka. We have 3 boats right now interested in being part of a conversion. We don't have money to cover the costs, which can be significant for doing the actual conversion, putting in the electric engines, and we're working on finding that so we can open up, invite more boats in. There's some fishermen that are able to front some of those upfront costs, but I would like to be able to help with those costs. So yes, doing it in Sitka. Yes, we have some boats. We're looking for more, and we're looking for funding to support the work.
Great. Thank you, Linda. And this one I think will be for Weatherly. And so how do we ensure that the permitting of aquaculture elevates and centers Indigenous participation and management at the start of the movement, so that really we can ensure Indigenous participation in the aquaculture movement in Alaska?
Well, I think our Indigenous Alaskans have been stewards of our marine environment and our environment. So like this could be an amazing opportunity for Indigenous Alaskans to like give back to the oceans, because right now, like we're just a mom and pop operation. Like it's the 3 of us, and like we were given the, you can go apply for your site through the Alaska Department of Natural Resources, and like we're all given the same permitting papers and paperwork. There's not like priorities for any certain group. I think it's like such a grassroots movement. Like if you're interested in doing this, like learning about it, coming to places like our farm and like really showing an interest and like wanting to do it is like the most important thing. When I see larger groups getting into it and like getting a huge site, like 100 or 200 acres, like it does worry me a little too. Like, I think we don't want to be greedy. We just should start with like a small plot. Like we started with 5 acres and have grown to 23, and that's like plenty. When you have an aquaculture site, like you're doing suspended culture and you have so much opportunity in like a small area to like grow your crops and like really produce in a small area. So I think we should be cautionary about the big groups going in and like, getting 100 acres or 200 acres. I think the state should start people off with a small amount and then move on from there. Like people should have to prove their production before going really big into it. So I'm not sure like how to actually do that, but that would just be like my suggestion to the state, like that people should start off small and then work their way up. So they're not like, going in and just taking 100 acres and, not using it, which would be more of like a commercial, thing. Like, I think if they start small and then prove that what they're doing is working, that would be the best way to, do it and ensure everyone has the same opportunity.
Thank you, Weatherly. Yeah, and so, I guess I have a question for everybody in the panel, but, if you're sitting at the North Pacific Council right now, or if you go to the Board of Fish right now, or all virtually given, or if you are even just Googling Alaska fisheries climate change, one of the first things that's going to come up is is the shifting cod stock, right? Is our fish moving north, and kind of a little bit highlighted in one of the questions we had earlier about, our management and the science. How do we? I'm not going to ask it so broad. How do we address this? But how do we better track that in the policy in real time? As the Board of Fisheries tries to address it in the state of Alaska, and tries to have adaptive management, as the North Pacific Council tries to adapt to shifting stocks, how do we as stakeholders adapt and suggest to these management bodies how to adapt to these rapidly shifting stocks as the ocean is going through some warming? What are steps that that average stakeholder Joe like myself can walk into the council and take, or groups we can join to try to be engaged as we see these things? And is it just asking for more research and science dollars? What are our steps for addressing things like the cod shift?
So I'm happy to take the first stab at that, but I, sorry, others can cut me off or jump in afterwards. But so the council does have an ecosystem committee, and that's a place where people, I think, can engage to say, we're seeing these big ecosystem impacts. We have a lot of concerns about what these ecosystem level changes might have on fish stocks, and here's our suggestion for how to address that. The council is, although it may seem like a really confusing process, they take public testimony on every topic. They take written testimony as well as oral testimony. It's more complicated now by the pandemic and everything being virtual, but certainly open to hearing from people. I think the process is also going to need to grapple with this issue of these impacts can't be put in one specific box. They are cross-cutting with crab, with cod, with pollock, with halibut, and the council has been accustomed to taking amendment changes one species at a time, one reg issue at a time, and there is going to need to be more focus on the ecosystem and how we think about managing this ecosystem as our stocks move, and distribution changes and the impacts of those changes to the industry and to coastal communities, where the fish used to show up here, now they're showing up here. Who has access to those fish, and how do you take care of the people who have lost access? So I think it's going to be an evolving process, and we need all the best minds at the table to help shape how that evolves.
Does anybody want to take a stab at the cod question?
So one of the amazing things that we have here in the state of Alaska when it comes to fisheries management is how incredibly public our processes are for how our fisheries are managed. So we have the North Pacific Fishery Management Council process, which the council meeting just started this week with the Scientific and Statistical Committee meeting today. And they meet 5 times a year. Now in a virtual world, they're almost 2.5 week-long meetings, and they allow unprecedented opportunities to be able to weigh in not only with the people who are making the regulatory decisions, but also to gather information and share feedback with a lot of the scientists and regulators who are helping influence fisheries decisions and are really the boots on the ground for being able to tell what is happening with our fish stocks and how as an industry we can respond. So the North Pacific Council is a great opportunity to be able to not only attend and weigh in, but also learn a tremendous amount of information. Linda already mentioned which is a phenomenal resource, especially if you just want to hear a bunch of people who are really experts in the field talk about what's happening in this state when it comes to fish stocks. But also council is aggressively trying to determine how to incorporate climate change more frequently into the management plans that they have. So there's entire sections and reports at this council meeting that's going to be occurring over the next 2.5 weeks that are specific to climate change and what's happening with our stock and how we can do a better job of incorporating that into the management decisions made. So, the North Pacific Council is a phenomenal resource, and it's a phenomenal example. Also have the Board of Fisheries, of course, that handles all of our state managed fisheries. They also meet around 5 times a year, depending on the cycle. Your region may not necessarily be up in a given year, but there's lots of opportunities to be able to weigh in with those decision makers and also interact with the managers of the fisheries and the science within the management team that are the ones that are boots on the ground gathering the information and then pushing this information forward. So the Board of Fish has as much information as possible when they're making these management decisions, and also so the public is fully informed of the information that they have. Is the data that we have perfect? Absolutely not. But our managers work every single day to make sure that they can gather as much information and science and data as possible so the right decisions can be made. One of the things that people tend to criticize in the state is that we don't have the best fisheries management in the world, because you can see a stock shifting and a fishery closure, like what we saw in the Gulf of Alaska for cod. Now, finally getting to your question, Ephraim. We saw a directed cod shutdown in the Gulf of Alaska in response to what we were seeing with cod stocks, and to make sure that those stocks were sustainable for future generations, to make sure that those cod stocks were coming back year after year. We had to take a tremendous hit in order to be able to make sure that that happens. But when it comes to sustainability, this is how we sustainably manage fisheries. So you may have an extraordinary harvest when it comes to Bristol Bay sockeye salmon, or you may have an extraordinary harvest when it comes to Bristol Bay herring or some of the Southeast herring stocks that we have. And Kodiak is just seeing a tremendous rebound in tanner crab, where they haven't really seen tremendous fisheries in the last couple of years. They're gearing up next year, like at the very start of the year, to be able to have one of their biggest harvests in a number of years. So what goes up must come down. And we are responsive to that in our management plans. We take swift, decisive action to make sure that species are sustainable for future generations to be able to enjoy, and that we get to be able to maintain our status as having the best managed fisheries in the world. So those are some of the things that people can do in order to be able to respond to what's happening with climate change. Just make sure that you're weighing in and paying attention to the management bodies. Also, again, I'm going to put a plug in to make sure that you talk to your state of Alaska government, and that you also talk to your congressional delegation about the importance of research dollars, because all of the questions that people are looking to have answered, a lot of those questions cost money to be able to gather that information. So make sure that you're advocating and that you're supporting the research projects that matter to you. Ephraim, I know you have a lot of experience in your time working in DC and know how effective it can be to have a number of people weighing in on a single item, especially when it comes to fisheries. So those are definitely some of the things that I encourage people to do in order to make sure that they're staying informed and that they're also helping advocate. And please don't just get all of your information on Facebook. Our managers in the state of Alaska are incredibly responsive. So don't be shy about picking up the phone or sending an email and requesting more information if you can't seem to find it on the internet, or doing a search through what NIMS has available, what the North Pacific Council has available, what the Board of Fish has available, and what ADF&G has available.
Thank you very much, Julianne. But it's a good point that doing your own research doesn't always mean just Facebook and YouTube. It can also be direct sources. So we also had Dr. Westley join us during the Q&A here as he finished class, and I get to put him directly on the spot. So thank you very much for joining us, Dr. Westley. He is Associate Professor for CFOS, the College of Fisheries and Ocean Sciences at University of Alaska, Fairbanks. Peter is a Professor of Fisheries Conservation and Fisheries Ecology. His research interests, as in his words, as we live in the Anthropocene, where global ecology is dominated by human activity. His research seeks to understand how fish respond and adapt to abrupt environmental change across levels of biological organization. Work in his lab addresses this overarching question through the combination of field, laboratory, meta-analysis, and modeling approaches. Additionally, he has pending proposals to explore aspects of the pike invasion to South Central Alaska and to apply stage-specific salmon life cycle models to Western Alaska Chinook populations. Specifically, the pike invasion has been one of the most intriguing things I ever stumbled across in my work back in DC. And so I would love to hear more about that offline, Dr. Wesley, because that is, yeah, one of those tough nuts to crack. So with that, I will pass the mic over to you, and we really appreciate you rushing over here to be with us today right after teaching.
Oh, well, thank you for that introduction, and apologies for being late, but also I'll share with you all, coming from my 100 level sort of introductory fisheries class, and man, every year I have so much optimism, and I'm so uplifted by the next generation that's coming. I mean, man, they really get it. Like, they're fired up, they're passionate, they're curious and want to learn more. And as a lifelong Alaskan, I grew up in Anchorage. I continue to be optimistic, but also not a Pollyanna, because there's obviously lots of challenges that we're facing. But I'm optimistic that we're going to have really the best available people working on these wicked problems, bring in the best tools and best sources of information wherever they come from. So I'm uplifted by that. So thank you for the introduction. And I guess I'll also say, if I hit on any of the same things that you've talked about in my absence, I apologize, but hopefully they're complementary and reinforcing. But I just wanted to reflect a little bit about, particularly, yes, thinking about salmon in particular, this species that ties together ecosystems, cultures, economies. It's such an important way of life for Alaskans. Reflecting a little bit about salmon in the ocean, and think about what, how far we've come. So literally, I'm not that old, and when I was learning about salmon ecology and biology, there was literally a slide I remember from a very, very famous salmon biologist that essentially had a black box, and it was like the ocean, and the fish go into a black box, and we know very little or almost nothing about what happens to salmon in the ocean. And that black box now has been really illuminated. We know a lot about what's going on. So I pulled off the shelf just one example, right? It's like, here's one of the new books, Salmon Ecology in the Ocean. This thing weighs as much as probably like an average sockeye, right? So we have a lot of information about what's going on in salmon in the ocean, things like distribution, mortality rates, diets, interactions between their own species and other species, aspects of predation that's changing in time through marine mammals and other predators, things like sharks. I mean, so we've learned a lot, and it's not that long ago that literally there were people that were convinced that any salmon that was found offshore was probably lost and never made it home. And now we know that salmon, and that's a real deal. Archie Huntsman was a Canadian researcher that absolutely was convinced that any salmon that was caught offshore was lost and was gone to us. Of course, he was wrong. And now we know that salmon use deviations in the Earth's geomagnetic field as a map that's inherited to get them close to their home river, after which they then smell their way home using waypoints that they've laid down when they were little fish leaving their home rivers. So we know a ton. And I would almost say, dare I say, that we are swimming in information, we're drowning in information too. That can be a challenge. So we're more informed now than ever. And that in and of itself is empowering, but also can be a challenge of having so much information. So I wanted to hit on a couple of highlights that seem to be what's our new understanding of salmon in the ocean. Some current things. One is that, yes, climate change is the whatever pound elephant in the room that you want to call it, we are working and in a context of a changing ocean with climate. But climate interacts with other changes, obviously. So one of the things that's increasingly clear that we know about in the ocean is that paradoxically, even though there are many places in Alaska, other places of salmon range where there's not enough salmon coming back, is that the ocean is full of salmon. In fact, there's more salmon in the ocean than there has been in a really long time. So it seems like a bit of a paradox. But the evidence that's emerging out of this, the weight of evidence by a lot of work, my lab and my students and postdocs have contributed some to this, is that all the fish in the sea can come at a cost to certain species, and can come at a cost not only to survival, but things like changing size and age of spawners. So one of the trends that we've seen, and that is backed up by generations of knowledge and observations by harvesters, is that salmon of different species in different parts of Alaska, when they're coming back to pond, tend to be smaller. And that the best analyses and tools that we have suggest that that is at least partly explained by all the fish in the oceans interacting with climate. Okay, and so there's this paradox of so many fish in the ocean, but it can come at a cost of having smaller fish, and at worst, perhaps impacting the survival of things like Western Alaska Chinook, where some work by a postdoc of mine has actually associated Western Alaska Chinook survival with things like the Asian chun salmon production from hatcheries and potential competition between those things. So there's essentially hidden costs to some of these lots of fish in the ocean. And some of that is obviously wonderful, because those fish in the ocean are both wild fish that are coming out of their home rivers, but also too, it's true that, you know, in a given year, there's about 6 billion Pacific salmon that are released from hatcheries each year into the ocean, on top of the wild fish. And so what's emerging is, I think, a new realization that what we benefit from things like hatcheries, we need to be thinking about what's the net gain, and what's the role of sort of international agreements in hatcheries into this shared ocean. That's one of the real, I think, in my career, I'm hoping to help inform those conversations. I know that they are fraught. I know they are difficult conversations. They're also global. It involves global issues in a shared ocean. But we're getting closer and closer. We've got some projects actually starting to address these things, thinking about Prince William Sound as a case study, to actually explore, you know, what are some different scenarios if we change what we're doing? What would be the benefit for people? What would be the benefit for the wild fish? And I'll just leave, I guess, I don't know how much time I've taken here from shift the questions, I guess, but that the feeling is emerging that absolutely we can increase the number of fish in the ocean by releasing them from hatcheries, but we don't get as much as we think. We don't get as much benefit as we think, because it does appear to come at the cost of wild fish. That's increasingly a fact. And it's something that I hope that we can all be honest about and start thinking about, okay, so what are some scenarios? What are some potential, and there's tools we have to explore this together to say, okay, well, if we change what we're doing by this amount, what would be the benefit? What are the trade-offs associated with this? That helps inform those conversations. But I think that's where we stand now. I think I'll leave it there for now, and would welcome the conversation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wesley. That was very helpful. And with your hatchery fish comments and expertise, I'm sure you'll be a sought after witness at the Board of Fish sometime in the near future, which I don't envy. But yeah, so I mean, you brought up some interesting stuff there, particularly the international aspect, right? We have been talking about and thinking about this through the lens of our local, state, and federal level, but you're right. I mean, this is climate. This isn't going to be solved here in Alaska, and this isn't going to be solved at least holistically, even at the federal level. So, you know, when we look at international solutions and international policy here, you know, I know 30 by 30, Linda, you touched on that briefly, it started out as an international effort. You also served as an advisor on the North Pacific Anadromous Fish Commission. What are we seeing at the international level? And I'll start with you, Linda, as opportunities for solutions or working I don't even know what the right word is. It's not, but at every level to address climate and adaptation specifically.
Thanks, Ephraim. Yeah, I have not been as involved in those like anadromous fish commission conversations for quite some time. So hopefully I won't misrepresent any of that. But I mean, the real benefit of those conversations is there is a sharing of data between the Pacific Rim countries of the research being done by everybody in those countries on salmon and on where the fish are going, what's happening in hatcheries. And I think that's really important since, as you said, what happens in one country is certainly going to affect the health of salmon and therefore the health of all who depend on salmon. So that those conversations are increasingly, of course, also recognizing the impact of climate change on our salmon stocks. And the science is trying to catch up with what's behind some of those changes. And that, I think, is as Dr. Westerly just said, we're starting to see smaller fish and starting to associate that with the number of fish in the ocean, possibly with climate change. So that information is really sharing is super important, as is taking action at that level, because that's what's required. And I would say that there's a lot of conversation also around the world about carbon pricing and ways to have border adjustments for goods coming into the country. If say the US put in place a carbon fee and dividend program, so we aren't disadvantaging our US businesses, and we are putting pressure on countries that haven't yet addressed the impacts of or their carbon emissions and those impacts. So there's a need for that kind of global thinking on the policy level. And as you said, also with 30 by 30, it did come from the international sphere. There's been a lot of work internationally to think about ways to integrate sustainable practices and indigenous wisdom, local economies, and that needs to be part of the global solutions. So yeah, it's always enact locally, but think globally certainly is becoming increasingly important as we approach climate change.
Great, thank you, Linda. And we had a question, but for Weatherly, she might have dropped out of the Wi-Fi problems. But so now that we have Dr. Wesley here, though, one question I have that Julianne, you kind of highlighted it in your comments, and I think it would be good to kind of go back to and have a little discussion about it. Is, we are talking about stock declines all the time, and we're talking about fish crashes, fish disasters. That's what shows up in the news, right? Especially in Western Alaska, for example, we have our even subsistence closures this year in some parts of the state for some of the first times ever. But then when we look down at Bristol Bay, we're seeing record-breaking years. So it's this paradox here where, and I think some folks would have trouble parsing and understanding why that is and what actually is going on. So if somebody could discuss that a little bit, I think that would be helpful for folks.
Well, I think what it absolutely hits on is that there's not one state of Alaska salmon. It depends on where you're at. It also hits on the fact that Alaska is an anomaly in the world, in the sense that, compared to other places, we tend to be doing better in terms of the number of salmon we have in our habitat, despite well-known issues. It's far from pristine, but we're doing better. But even within the anomaly of Alaska, Bristol Bay is off the charts as an anomaly anywhere in the world in terms of its production. And it's a beautiful exception. There are some things that we can point to say why that's the case. One is the life history of the fish themselves, right? Sockeye are tied to these inland oceans and these lakes, and Bristol Bay is a region dominated by these large lakes. And so there's this perfect matching of the biology and the physical aspects of its habitat. That's just a perfect spot for sockeye. So there's lots of capacity naturally, but there's also, we know because of that complex habitat where the fish are, is that we've had the evolution of unique populations that gives us essentially money in the bank diversity, that when one group's not doing very well, other groups are. It's a diverse portfolio, and it's been maintained, and it's been maintained because of there's essentially no roads, there's no dams, there's no logging, there's no invasive species. You know, climate change is looming, and we're seeing impacts of that for sure. And there's something to the fact that there is clear management structure in Bristol Bay, that whether it works for all people there, I think is questionable, and whether it's totally equitable is a separate issue, but there's a clear management structure that it's escapement based, it's clear, and it's biologically sound. And so that's great. Bristol Bay is an exception and wonderful. There's lessons there. And at the same time, there's other places that have clear objectives for management, really intact, beautiful habitat, very close to Bristol Bay. I'm thinking Chignik now, near and dear to my heart, where I've done work. And Chignik, that used to have such a reliable fishery, is in the tank, right? And so there's lessons from Bristol Bay. I often sometimes wonder how representative it is, but we can't lose sight of some of the lessons. But if anyone is confused to why it's so variable, they should be confused, because there's not one state of salmon in Alaska.
Does anybody else want to chime in on that question?
I guess I did just want to pick up on that portfolio aspect of that, because I think that's something we've really seen in Bristol Bay, and it's important in this climate change management piece, that there are rivers in Bristol Bay that weren't huge producers maybe 10 years ago, and now the runs coming and going out of those what were minor streams are big parts of what's sustaining the runs. And who knows all of why, maybe the fish too, but we don't. But I think it just highlights how important it is to continue to maintain habitat for salmon, for all fish, beyond what's being used just now. So there is room, as climate changes patterns and puts more pressure on stocks, for those fish to redistribute as they need to survive. And I'm thinking about the Tungus right now, where we do have salmon habitat that's blocked by failed culverts, and the need to restore those culverts so salmon can return to those spawning streams. And again, who knows when one of those streams that's right now blocked might be critically important to the species as a whole, to the fish returning. And I think as far as marketing, the story that we always try to tell is how hard our fishermen are working and advocating for a healthy resource. Our future's integrally tied to the health of the fish, and we take a long-term view of that. And while things aren't perfect, we're always working to address the conservation issues. And I guess I wanted to go back to something that Julianne said about cod stocks dropping, and that 80% hit that the fleet took that year in their catch limits. And it wasn't a fishery that my members were that involved in, but I listened to the testimony, and I didn't hear a single fisherman who testified say, don't drop the quota. They all recognized the quota needed to be cut to save that stock and allow it to recover. And that's a story people need to hear, that no, things aren't perfect, but fishermen are willing to do what needs to be done to sustain the stocks and take care of the habitat for the future.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Linda. That's a good highlight and reminder. Not only are fishermen the eyes and ears of for all of us on the water, but we are the true stewards of the oceans. Along with obviously the indigenous people of Alaska and nationwide and worldwide. There was a question in the chat box that disappeared for me, but it was about, and I believe it was for Weatherly, but we can all probably chime in and everybody has their opinions. I'll bow out. But it was about the future of fish farming in Alaska. And, we've seen successes in places like Norway, but we've also seen a lot of places that were a lot less successful. It's a politically charged issue, just like similar to hatcheries, but in different ways in Alaska. Is there a future for fish farming and a place for fish farming, fin fish farming in Alaska? And so I'll kick that to you, Weatherly, if you want to start us off.
Well, as we know, fish farming is banned in Alaska, but to me, after studying aquaculture, I do think of what we're doing as partially fish farming, how we, in the hatchery programs are releasing juvenile salmon into the oceans, and that's considered sea ranching. And I mean, I think we maybe want to take another step back and look at what we're actually doing, that releasing juvenile salmon, they grow up in the ocean competing with wild fish, and their chance of survival and getting genetically integrated into a wild fish population is actually higher than if we were raising the salmon in a net pen. Like a salmon raised in a net pen that gets released probably doesn't have a great chance of survival because it's been fed its whole life. So I just think like the hatchery program and fish farming in general has gotten a really bad rap because it's a big competitor. Like hatchery and farm raised salmon can be available to markets year round, every week, whereas our fish are frozen when they're caught wild. And, it's like a pretty big market competitor, but in the future, it might be something that we look at more because it can be done sustainably and environmentally friendly. And I mean, who's to say if sea ranching or fish farming is worse? We need to understand people farming fish aren't like the worst people in the world. They are stewards of their environment too, and they want a healthy ecosystem for their salmon to grow in. It takes like healthy, clean water to grow salmon. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents.
Thank you, Weatherly. And so here's another question from the chat. And I'll kick it to you, Julianne, to start. And I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, but how do we balance promoting and marketing Alaska's fisheries as sustainable and we're the best, and I mean that is the work on ASME and elsewhere versus the ask and the real need that we all recognize for more research dollars to understand climate and the other challenges that our fisheries are facing. It's a tightrope we have to walk, and how do folks in the processing industry look at that as kind of our market facing part of the sector?
Yeah, I definitely touched on that a little bit earlier in weaving in multiple questions into one answer, but I think it's definitely worth mentioning in a different way that ecosystem changes are always something that Alaska's fisheries management system is monitored. And wild seafood is a product of its natural marine environment. Responsible fisheries management is really the core of sustainability of Alaska's fisheries and, of course, of the seafood industry, which Linda was able to amplify that fact when we were talking about the stock declines in the Gulf of Alaska for cod and talking about how fishermen were advocating for their own reductions. And that's really how we view fisheries management in the state of Alaska. But ensuring that fisheries are managed sustainably is really how we can support ocean abundance and protect our most valuable resources in the face of a changing climate. So we can't control everything that happens in the ocean environment. We just can't. And sometimes gathering all the data in the world isn't going to give us all of the answers that we need, but we can control our response in a way that supports long-term sustainability for Alaska seafood. So in hearing some of the comments from the panelists and some of the questions, it seems like there's a lot of opportunities for additional panels to be able to touch on specific issues here. And I'm hoping that there's some interest in continuing some of the talks and really bringing in some of the scientists and the researchers and the managers who are impacting these fisheries and the way that they're managed every single day. So I'm really hopeful that these types of discussions can continue. I think it would be really valuable to have ADF&G show up and be able to talk about specifically about their salmon management around the state of Alaska, because every area has active salmon management. It's responsive to what's going on with the climate. It's responsive to what's going on with intercept fisheries. It's responsive to what's happening with our environments, with habitat, and really with the resource health itself. And while we're at it, I think we could also get some individuals who are experts in the hatchery industry to be able to show up and talk about hatchery salmon in the state of Alaska and the massive wild hatchery interaction study that's occurring right now, which is kind of a multifaceted effort. It's a little bit spearheaded by ADF&G and others who really care about what's happening with the state of salmon in Alaska. So I guess those conversations I think are ripe for continuance, and I really hope that we get to further those goals through additional panels.
Thank you, Julianne.
And maybe could I add to that real quickly? So
absolutely.
Just to clarify for folks too, so I'm actually on the science panel for that large project that Julianne was just referencing. It's a multi-year, multi-million-dollar project that's trying to understand the interactions between hatchery and wild fish. And the results that are emerging are honestly in line with what we've seen other places, is that hatchery fish, that when they spawn in the wild, really do a whole lot worse than the wild fish, consistent with the idea that they don't do well in wild conditions, and it's got consequences. And so the other conversations that I think need to be had too is like, what do we do with that information, right? So what are the policy implications of that? And there's a lot of ongoing work right now to try to understand that, to interpret those data and to make wise choices, again, taking into account the trade-offs. So there is a lot of good work going on. And then, yeah, all of these conversations feel like they're just a start.
Yeah, well, and before we close up shop here, I would like to give each of the panelists a moment to have any closing remarks. If there's any final things you'd like to say, or just comments about impacts that you're seeing or potential solutions that we have on the table, or paths towards climate solutions that we can that our attendees can be looking at. And again, if there's questions that didn't get answered here, we can follow up afterwards as well. But yeah, I just wanted to kick it around the circle once, and I'll go around calling on everybody. And so Linda, I'll start with you.
Sure, thanks, Ephraim. And I feel like I've talked a lot, so I will try to be a little bit brief here. But I guess what comes through to me is how important with climate change it is to think about our place here on this planet and our interactions with the environment in a new way, and to think about it at a new scale, because these impacts are daunting, they're global, and I have a sense of the urgency, and that if we don't move quickly to change, the future doesn't look anything like the past and the abundance that we've had the opportunity to enjoy up here in Alaska. So that really has been an incentive for my work now, or that realization, and for our engagement at the national level on this 30 by 30 initiative, and our businesses for conservation and climate action. It's that we all need to be part of the solution to recognizing that we have to change how we have done business and approached harvesting, approached growing, approached ranching, approached what we put into the atmosphere, and how we treat the earth. That there are great examples up here in Alaska of doing it right. There are great examples all across the the country of people who are doing it right, of Indigenous stewardship through sustainable community-based businesses at all levels. So that's what we need to learn from. That's what we need to perpetuate and support and evolve towards, so that we do have the same opportunities for our children that we've been able to enjoy here. And one more big shout out, I guess, to the scientists and the managers of Alaska's fisheries. It really are cutting edge and supporting the future for the fisheries, and trying to keep up with how fast the changes are, and really appreciate that work that they're doing. And thank you. I've really appreciated being part of the panel.
Thank you. And that, I know I'm just going the order I'm seeing people on the screen. So Dr. Wesley, if you'd like to have some closing remarks.
Yeah, just thinking about the future, and again, coming back to being a lifelong Alaskan, and excited by the opportunity of having conversations like this, where we as a community, as citizens of Alaska, right, can weigh in on what we want our future to look like, because the chapter for Alaska, and again, sort of thinking about salmon, but fisheries as a whole in the face of climate change, I mean, it's just not written yet. Other places, the options have been taken off the table. So what I'm thinking is, I'm thinking about the Columbia River Basin. When you have that many main stem dams and other things in a system like that, the options become limited of what you can reasonably do. And Alaska still has a lot of options on the table. We have choices still to make, and those choices have there's trade-offs associated with them. And so I'm optimistic to be, as a citizen, part of those conversations where I can, to try to help inform those conversations. That's, in my mind, is the role of science, is to not suggest any particular policy outcome, but to explore what are the potential pros and cons, the trade-offs associated with different choices. And it would be wonderful to have these conversations, start thinking about where do we want to be, but equally as important to have agreement of where do we not want to go, where do we not want to fall off the rails, and how do we avoid that. So I'm looking forward to co-creating our history together.
Thank you very much. And Weatherly, to you.
Well, I think like the Indigenous peoples of Alaska took such good care of our environment. We have a lot to learn from them, and the way that how to take care of our environment. I think we need to step back and like really try to like learn more from people that have taken care of our planet and the environment about how to make things better for our future. Like, we're polluting so much, and like I just think of our kids and our future generations and handing them a world that isn't healthy, like, and it just makes me get up every day and try to work as hard as I can to like change what we're doing, because everything we do has an impact on something else. And like, I think we really need to have more humility and just think more about ourselves as part of this earth, and how we can, support all living creatures, not just ourselves, and do it sustainably and work together, for a healthy planet. Because I just think we're going to reach a point where we've put too much carbon dioxide into our atmosphere, and it's going to be a point of no return. Like, so we really need to work now and work, towards saving our planet. Well, I'm going to be dire, but
No, I appreciate that, Weatherly. You're right. We need to ring the alarm. And Julianne, I'll kick it over to you before I close this out.
Yeah, I mean, I've spent a lot of time talking about really the opportunities that we have here in the state of Alaska, and I just want to put in one final plug for people to get involved, to research the information that's already out there, to listen to the different presentations at the different fisheries management bodies, whether it's the North Pacific Fishery Management Council or the Board of Fish, or other, excuse me, or other avenues as well, to be able to get educated and know what type of information is actually out there already. I think we have opportunities to learn from other states and also learn from other countries and be able to take those lessons and build an even better fisheries management structure here in Alaska. But again, also a lot of this takes funding, and we need to make sure that we are assisting our regulators and getting them the funding that they need to get those questions answered. Thanks, Ephraim.
Yeah, absolutely. And now that I'm not a staffer any longer in any of our congressional or governor's offices, I can strongly make a plug for, reach out and bother all those staffers, get a hold of them. I don't have to answer those emails anymore. No, it was a pleasure. But so I'm going to close this out here. And so just over the past few months, as part of the Alaska Climate Opportunities Assessment, Nature Conservancy and really all Alaskan stakeholders have had the privilege of being at, but Nature Conservancy has hosted more than 1,000 Alaskans as we discussed climate change with Alaskan leaders, renewable energy with statewide industry experts, innovation and tech opportunities with entrepreneurs, infrastructure, natural climate solutions, and public health challenges with Alaska Native leaders. But they're ending it today with our big bang discussion on fisheries across the state as it pertains to climate. We're sincerely grateful to you all for tuning in and staying engaged with us, for all of your questions. And to learn more about the Nature Conservancy and Alaska's Climate Opportunities Assessment, and to view the specially commissioned reports, please visit nature.org/AK Climate Opportunity. Again, that's nature.org/AK Climate Opportunity. And a sincere thank you to Linda, Julianne, Weatherly, and Peter for their expert input and firsthand perspective. And thank you also to the Nature Conservancy in Alaska and Calandra Associates for hosting this important discussion today. This is an issue that's near and dear to our hearts as Alaskans. This is what I consider to be my life's work. It was an honor to be here hosting this panel today. It was specifically an honor not to have to say too much and let you all really bear the brunt. And I learned a lot, and I think it really raised a lot more questions. So, like folks said, I think we should have more follow-ups. So for Stephanie and Andy at the Nature Conservancy, let's keep this going. I think there are breakout panels just based off this panel alone. And I'm going to get you out of here with 2 minutes to spare. And so I really appreciate everybody for being here today. And, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.